One of the things that I like the most about Frank Hamer is he's a man of some very large contradictions. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our series based on some iconic figures of the American West and the firearms that they used. Before we go any further, I must reveal that the subject of today's video, Frank Augustus Hamer, is not only my favorite character from the Old West, but my favorite American ever. So I might appear to be a little biased, but I'll try to tell the story as best I can. Frank Hamer's name would become synonymous not only with the Old West, but law enforcement and the relentless pursuit of justice. Known mainly for ending the crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde in 1934, Hamer's law enforcement career actually spanned 4 decades, 52 gunfights, 17 bullet wounds, and he was left for dead 4 times. Based on those statistics alone, it's not any wonder that he became the most feared and respected lawman not only of his day, but in American history. Frank was born March 17, 1884 in Fairview, Texas. Around the time he turned 10, the family moved to Oxford, Texas, in the Hill Country. Frank's father was a blacksmith, and he early on worked as a calf wrangler in his father's shop. Like most people in that era, Frank only went to school to around junior high as we would understand it now. But while in school, he was academically very gifted. He excelled in mathematics and did very well in history, which he had a natural interest in growing up in that part of Texas. He spent many a night reading books about the Comanche and, oddly enough, had what we would probably know now as a photographic memory. All of that would kind of help him later on in his law enforcement career because, more than school, he loved to live his life outside. He endlessly hunted and fished in the hill country and, importantly, studied the behavioral patterns of all of the animals that he would see. This helped him become a more efficient hunter and later on as an adult, a more efficient law enforcement officer because he would in fact apply that skill set of studying the past behavior of people to help him apprehend extremely dangerous fugitives, like Bonnie and Clyde. Before we go any further, I have to put a little bit of a warning in today's video. Some of what you're going to hear, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool Texas fan or perhaps a Texas Rangers fan, is going to be a little controversial. That's okay. I'm going to tell you the truth as I know it. So I'll list some of the sources that I used at the end of the video, and perhaps you can do your own research as I have and come up with your own conclusions. Around the time Frank turned 16 years old, his life took a little bit of a dark turn. Like a lot of people his age, he and his brother Harrison were hired out by a neighboring rancher named Dan McSwain. He would commonly hire people for day laborers to help around the ranch and the farm. McSwain's experience with the Hamer boys was such that he knew that they were very good with firearms. So good, to the point one day, McSwain asked Frank Hamer how he would like to earn an extra $150. That was a lot of money back then, of course. And Frank said, well, who do I have to kill? As a joke. Well, it turned out McSwain wasn't joking. He was having some issues and property disputes with another neighboring rancher, and he wanted to hire Frank to settle his problems. Frank was a little startled and said that he wouldn't do that for $150. And after a couple of days of thought, McSwain decided that it was better, even though he warned Frank not to tell, if Frank wasn't around to tell. So this is how smart McSwain is. One day while both of the boys are out working for him, he sends Harrison over to the barn. As Harrison's about to go in the barn, he hears a gunshot where McSwain has actually taken a shotgun and shot Frank in the back. As it turns out, Frank was carrying a small pistol on his person that day, and he actually wounded McSwain, though not fatally. While on the retreat, Frank found his way into a little bit of a draw or a ditch culvert kind of thing, depending on who you ask, and he waded out while bleeding and severely wounded. The only reason that his life was spared was a black sharecropper happened by and got him back to his parents' house where he spent the next few months recovering. Later on in the video, you're going to draw your own conclusions about why Frank chose some of the unpopular racial positions he did, especially for that period of time in Texas. But I think you can kind of trace it back to a lonely sharecropper who saved his life when he was a young man. After Frank had fully recovered, he decided that he wasn't going to let it go, and he shows up back on McSwain's porch to settle accounts, according to Frank's own words. Well, both of them went for it, and one of them lay there dead, and as you probably already figured out, it wasn't Frank. He then found his way, he and his brother once again, to a different rancher, the name of Ketchum, who was a distant relation of the notorious outlaw Blackjack Ketchum. While on that farm, he had a choice to kind of break bad and become a horse thief and a bandit, but for whatever reason decided against it, and one day circumstances were he actually helped apprehend a horse thief. One of the local sheriffs at the time was so impressed with Frank's bearing, he was a very large man for the time, he told him that he should get into law enforcement, and before too long, Frank had joined Company C of Captain Rogers' Rangers. Like any person interested in survival, Frank would try to use and try to obtain the best weapons available at the time. When he began his law enforcement career, that would be the Colt Single Action Army revolver, 45 long Colt, he called his Old Lucky, and of course an 1873 Winchester. That was state of the art at the time. But as time moved on and better weapons were invented, Frank was using them. He once stated that the best revolver ever made was a Remington triple lock. He was known to use a .35 Remington caliber semi-automatic rifle, and that is actually the one that he would use the day he stepped out of the tree line to confront Bonnie and Clyde. All of that is verified by his son, Frank Hamer Jr., and who still has actually all of Frank's old weapons. At times, some of them have been on display at the Texas State Historical Society, but now, to my knowledge, they're all back with the family where they belong. The Texas Rangers at that time really had more of a utilitarian role than they do now, obviously, as one of the premier law enforcement agencies in the country. Back then, they did a little bit of everything. Sure, law enforcement, but they also helped put down town riots, settled border disputes. So it was a little more of a total power kind of law enforcement position than most people perceive it now. And that's going to become important later on. In fact, at various times in the Rangers' history, they would become pretty much an armed security force for whatever white rich entity that could afford to employ them. And some of the atrocities got pretty out of hand, but more on that in a little bit. While a Ranger, Frank found himself in the middle of some of the most hotly contested crimes in Texas history. Around 1915, Mexico was deep into its own revolution and barely able to support itself, let alone bandits on the border that were operating on both sides, much as they had in the 1830s through the 1880s. Frank found himself in the middle of something called the Bandit War, and this is where the controversy comes into play about some of the behavioral patterns of the Rangers. They definitely murdered innocent people by mistake. It wasn't like you could Google addresses back then, and sometimes the wrong people got injured, hopefully for the right reasons, but as time went on, you would see this common trait that Frank is about to display to people, which is you would be a Ranger for a while, and then you would stop as the political climate changed in Texas, and say a governor was elected that had a little bit of a tighter rein on the Rangers. It's time to move on to a different job in law enforcement, which is what he did. He actually became a marshal in a completely lawless oil boomtown called Navasota, Texas. In a brief period of time, in a couple of years before Frank became the marshal, more than 100 people were killed on the streets in shootouts. So even though it's past the turn of the century, the West is still truly wild. Well, as it turns out, Frank tamed the town pretty much by himself, and after a few years would move on from Navasota to various other jobs in law enforcement. He re-enters the Rangers right around the 1920s or so, and finds himself in the middle of a racially charged climate in Texas. Organizations like the White Man's Union were notoriously corrupt, notoriously known for usurping the rights of all of the black citizens in Texas that they possibly could. And he also ran afoul of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a very, very powerful entity back then in America, period, but certainly in the racially charged South and Southwest. One of the cases that Frank happened to uncover while he was working in that capacity was something that he referred to as the banker's murder machine. What would happen is banks would pay $5,000 for dead bank robbers and not 1 cent for a live one. That's right off of their own advertisement, by the way. So the bankers and law enforcement decided that they could hire desperate people or people maybe that weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer to rob banks. And in the course of those bank robberies, the law enforcement would swoop in, murder the bank robbers, collect the reward, and split it back to the bank. None of those people were ever held legally liable for this, but Frank did all he could to expose this kind of corruption and murder for hire going on all throughout the Southwest and certainly in the hill country of Texas. Another amazing detail about Frank's life, at least I found it amazing, was not only was the West wild when you were at work, it could get pretty wild when you were not at work. Frank was briefly married early in his life, and when he turned 33, he married a widow named Gladys Sims. Gladys used to be married to a fellow named Ed Sims, and that's going to become important in a second because his distant relation was a guy named Gus McMeans, who was also a former Texas Ranger. Well, Gladys and her brother were suspected by the police of actually killing Ed Sims, but they were never formally charged or brought to trial, of course, so all that remained pretty much conjecture. Well, it must not have been too much conjecture to old Gus McMeans because on October 1st, 1917, at a gas station in Sweetwater, Texas, he decides that he's going to get a little revenge for his family, and what ends up happening is Frank and he end up in one heck of a gunfight. Frank is wounded in the course of this gunfight, but the problem was old Gus gets wounded through the heart, and he dies. When the cops came to sort the mess out, they found 7 revolvers, 2 automatic pistols, and 3 rifles between the two parties. So apparently, as you can tell, even though it's 1917, the West is still pretty wild. Maybe that's just another Saturday night in Sweetwater, but I think you can tell we're kind of setting the table for the type of people that were inhabiting Texas in that period of time. An awful, rough, rugged, and self-reliant bunch that wasn't prone to dialing 911. So, flash forward to 1934. In January of 34, Bonnie and Clyde have become mythical American folk heroes, as sad as that is, despite the fact that they've murdered dozens of innocent people by then. Bonnie Parker is all the rage fashion-wise. People in large cities are trying to imitate her. She's on magazines, and these two-bit hoodlums have become nothing short of heroes. January of 34, they actually break into East Ham Prison in Texas to break out some members of their gang. Course of that robbery, 1 guard was killed and another one wounded. The head of the Texas penitentiary system at the time was a fellow named Lee Sims, who was a friend of Frank Hamer's, and he'd officially had enough of Bonnie and Clyde. So he hired Frank Hamer as a special investigator to go on the road, and these are Lee Sims' exact words. Lee Sims told Hamer, put him on the spot, know you're right, and shoot everyone in sight. Well, being an experienced lawman, Hamer knew he was going to need some help, so he reached out to one of his old trusted ranger buddies, Manny Galt, and they went on the road. Using the same tactics Hamer used as a kid, he studied their behavioral patterns and was the first one to accurately predict where they might be. These car gangs traveled the country infinitum in sort of a random pattern, people believed at the time, robbing whatever they could along the way. In fact, for you historical folks out there, those car gangs are one of the main reasons why the National Firearms Act came into being, whether you're a fan of it or not. That's absolutely true. It was done to prevent crime. There's a scene in a movie, if you're interested in this topic, that everyone should watch. It's called The Highwaymen. It's an extremely well-acted film by Kevin Costner, and Woody Harrelson plays Manny Galt. There's a scene in the movie where they go into a normal sporting goods store. They don't really name the town, where Hamer was able to buy all of the weapons that Bonnie and Clyde were known to have used based on police reports as well as newspaper articles, which were Colt Monitor machine rifles, BARs, of course, lever-action guns, revolvers, semi-automatic pistols. It was amazing the amount of firepower that you could walk into a sporting goods store and buy. And the problem with all of that was law enforcement usually ended up on the business end of it. So, back to the story. They used their past behavioral pattern to accurately predict where they might be. And using a former member of the gang who had relocated himself down to Louisiana, they knew that Bonnie and Clyde were close. On May 23, 1934, in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, Frank and Manny had laid an ambush trap for Bonnie and Clyde. They got a former member of the gang and a known acquaintance to act like he was having car trouble alongside of the road. When Bonnie and Clyde stopped to lend assistance, they were ambushed by Frank, Manny, and a couple of other local law enforcement officers. Frank said very little about that event to anybody else for the rest of his life. He refused all notoriety that apprehension would have brought him in the terms of money. And in fact, he and Manny did not even attend their own Hero Day held in Austin, Texas. He shied away from that kind of spotlight, and based on the eyewitness accounts of people that knew him best, he always carried a little bit of weight around for actually killing those two, especially Bonnie Parker, in the manner that it had to be done. He did somewhat acknowledge that when he approached the car and he was the first one out of the tree line and stood in front of the car, that Clyde did seem inclined to go for his gun. It wasn't like they were just sort of gunned down without cause, but everybody knew they were not going to be brought to justice peacefully, and they were laid to rest alongside of the road that day. It shocked Frank and Manny, the mania that followed after that killing, and the way that this frenzy of public, they tore the car apart. It was amazing how ghoulish people could be, even back in 1934. So maybe sometimes the sort of perception we have of people being more decent back then, I think if you would have been alive back then, you might have a little bit different opinion of that. After the apprehension of Bonnie and Clyde, Frank went back to his security job, working mostly for oil companies throughout the Texas and the Southwest area. Frank's life finished out in relative obscurity. In the early 1950s, he had a severe heat stroke and his health never recovered. He died 2 years later on July 10, 1955, and is buried beside his son in Austin, Texas, that he lost in action on Iwo Jima during World War II. One of the things that I like the most about Frank Hamer is he's a man of some very large contradictions. It's hard to get your mind around the process that people lived in his period of time. Survival depended on being rugged, tough, smart, and almost completely self-reliant. But when you make the intentional decision to murder somebody at 16 years old and get away with it, meaning you're not charged, the law back then found that act to be completely justifiable, it kind of sets the table for some of the controversies that are about to follow. People lived life differently back then because it was different. It had to be. Texas was an extremely violent place, even back at the turn of the century. It's a total myth that somehow after the invention of barbed wires and the end of the cowboy heydays, that things got peaceful. They didn't. And the only way they got peaceful was you had to hire people willing to do a whole lot of violence for a greater peace. In my mind, that's the quintessential example of a Texas lawman, Frank Hamer. Self-reliant, tough, violent, but has an extremely well-developed sense of right and wrong and justice. And I think the state of Texas is better off for not only Hamer and Manny Galt and the Texas Rangers period, despite some of the more negative things that they might have done along the way. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I've sure enjoyed researching it. And once again, if you're interested in some more of these kinds of details about this period of time, there's an excellent book by Doug Swanson called The Cult of Glory, which is a true telling of the history of the Texas Rangers beyond the dime novel versions. Once again, The movie available on Netflix called The Highwaymen is another excellent choice, and any novel by John Boessenecker about Frank Hamer. He wrote a complete novel about the man's life, and it's an excellent source if you're interested in some more details. Thanks for viewing. Don't be afraid to like and subscribe.